Everyone to beautiful Robertson, beautiful day out there. As the introduction I just received, I've worked in the property industry for over 20 years. A big part of my work is navigating the planning system, and any of you that have worked in the planning system would understand it is a very, very complex system, overly so, to the point where I believe it's not serving us as a society as it should be. A lot of my work is preparing development applications, interacting with council. Yes, I've been to the Land Environment Court a few times in the last few years, unfortunately. It's not somewhere we want to go. It is a result of the complexity of the system. It's very difficult to interpret the legislation sometimes. Different people have different interpretations. Councils are often the approval authority for many of these things, and they have one interpretation. The development industry is very creative. We're good at finding ways through and getting over hurdles to get approval. Quite often our perspective of the planning system is slightly different. The courts are there to help sort out where the lines should be drawn from a legal perspective. One of the things that we do in our business is find niche markets. We like to do developments where we're not competing too heavily with everyone else out there in the industry. And small dwellings is one of those niche areas that we've been looking at. We've done developments with studio apartments and other small apartments. We've looked at manufactured housing estates where movable dwellings, relocatable dwellings are constructed off-site and brought to site. We haven't actually done one of those yet. We're trying to find a site where we can do that. We're also interested in tiny homes. All of these smaller typologies, we see them as opportunities because generally it's not as competitive as building 3 and 4 bedroom homes, which you find everywhere. And it's really been interesting over the past 5 years how much more interest there has been in tiny homes. I know a number of builders that have stopped building regular homes and now they're just building tiny homes full time because there's enough of market growing awareness in the community. So today what I'd like to do is provide information on planning pathways for tiny homes. What part of legislation should you be looking at and using to establish a tiny home on your property? I do warn you, I'll be talking about planning legislation, so I'll try to just make sure you don't fall asleep. So the first question we need to ask is, what is a tiny home? The term tiny home is just a broad generic term used throughout the development industry to describe small dwellings. Now, one of the things you've got to be aware of, though, is that the term tiny home is not used in New South Wales planning legislation. If you go into any planning document and try and find reference to tiny home, well, I'm talking about the actual legislation, you generally won't find it because it's not a defined term. So if you hear people talking about tiny homes, it could be any of these things. We've got a secondary dwelling, just a small secondary dwelling. We've got a modern caravan-style tiny home. Or you've got, down the bottom left there, relocatable homes, or manufactured homes. All of those could be referred to as tiny homes. Natalie's going to be delving into the secondary dwellings and a little bit about manufactured homes this afternoon, so I won't go into that. I'm going to deal with what is essentially caravans, and that's this one down here on the bottom right. The current market for these sort of things isn't the traditional caravans that we all went on holidays in back in the 1970s. They're really nice looking structures, but they are on wheels. In order to meet the state government legislative requirements for a caravan, there are certain things you've got to be aware of. One is the size of the caravan, because caravans have to be road registered. And to be road registered, there's a few things you need to achieve. So it can't be any more than 2.5 metres wide, 4.3 metres high and 12.5 metres long, and a total weight of 4.5 tonnes. Now, there are some exceptions. You can actually get a tiny home bigger than this, and there are still further limits. You can go slightly bigger, but if you want to move it on the road, you have to get special permits, and there's another process you have to go through. So it's a bit more of a challenge. And there's also special vehicles you need to tow these things around if they get bigger and heavier. There's obviously considerations if you're got to move one of these tiny homes from one place to another and go under bridges, you're limited by heights. If you're placing a caravan on your property, under the legislation, you have to prove that it's a caravan, and that means it needs to be road registered. So if you're building your own tiny home on your own site, you might think, I'll just make it because I like. If you do that, you won't comply with the legislation. The authorities could come along and say, well, it's not actually a caravan, you can't have that here. 3 planning pathways within New South Wales legislation to establish tiny homes. One is the movable dwelling provisions under the local government regulation. I'm going to go through each one of these in my presentation. I'm also providing some links at the end of my presentation to each of these sites, so if you're interested, you can go ahead and search into that. Another one of the provisions is the Exempt and Complying Development Code. Now, this is a state environmental planning policy, or a SEP as we call it in the industry. These SEPs apply right throughout New South Wales, and they often come over the top of any local provisions. You can sometimes ignore the local zoning so long as you comply with SEP. This particular part of the Exempt and Complying Development Code relates to farm stay accommodation. And finally, there's a development application process through the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. Many of you would be familiar with the DA process. I'll touch on that. Natalie's going to talk more about the DA process in her presentation. So if you want to look at the local government regulation, clause 77, it looks like this. It's really good reading if you're having trouble sleeping at night. I can recommend it. I'm not going to read this out, and I don't expect you to read it. I'm going to pick out some of the key parts of this legislation in the next few slides and run through it. So the first one is a typical Airbnb type use. So it's temporary use. This is a caravan put on a property set up to have tourists come and use it on a weekend or the like. Now, so this is under local government regulations, and there's a few things you have to be aware of. You don't need approval to put a caravan, even though we might refer to it as tiny homes, it's essentially just a caravan. You can have up to 2 caravans on your site, but it can't be occupied 24/7. You can only occupy it, this is under the legislation, no more than 2 days running, and no more than 60 days of the year. That's essentially weekends for 7 months of the year. But you can't have a tourist come in and live in it all week. So that's something to be really aware of. Now, I'm sure that people that set tiny homes and caravans up for this use, I'm sure this rule gets stretched. You can imagine it'd be a difficult thing for authorities to assess how often a caravan is being used. No doubt the authority's probably not even going to come and look at it unless there's a complaint or something looks out of place, then they might come and have a look at it. But this is what the legislation says: 2 caravans, no more than 60 days of the year, and no more than 2 consecutive days at a time. The most interesting thing from my perspective about this piece of legislation is that these caravans can be placed anywhere in the state, regardless of the zoning. So you could have a heavy industrial zone. If you own the property, you could put a caravan there for tourist use. Now, tourists probably wouldn't want to go there, but it just shows you how broad this bit of legislation is. There's no restriction on where these caravans can be placed. The next use is for permanent use, and I've put in brackets family use, and that'll become evident as I go through this next section. In this part of the legislation, only 1 caravan is permitted per site, and it must be in connection with a dwelling. So you must already have a house on the site. Then you can put 1 caravan in. However, the caravan must be used by the owner or a member of the owner's household. So technically this can't be used for tourist use. You can't invite people that you don't know to stay in the caravan. You also can't rent it out to someone that you don't know for permanent occupation. Interestingly, the way the legislation is written, the same person must own the land, the house, and the caravan. Technically, you would be contravening the legislation if you've got a house and someone that has a tiny home says, "Oh, can I come and put my tiny home on your land?" These things would be difficult for the authorities to keep track of. These rules do get blurred and pushed. This is the only part of the legislation that permits permanent long-term use of a caravan on a site. There's no restriction on zoning about where you can place a caravan with this part of the legislation, but you must have an existing approved house there. And so that drives which localities are appropriate. The final provision is that the caravan must be maintained in a safe and healthy condition. You can imagine if you put a caravan with a house, there's services involved to the house, so you should be able to discharge your sewage effluent and grey water into the sewage system. That provision makes me think that this is a provision that gives authorities a bit of teeth. If someone is doing the wrong thing and they're not maintaining the caravan properly, the authorities can come along and use that part of the legislation to say, you've got to sort this out and it's not appropriate. So that's something to be aware of. So the final part of the legislation under the local government regulation is accommodation for agricultural workers. 1 caravan per site, per farm is permitted. It has to be on agricultural land. The legislation says it can only be used seasonally for workers, and it has to be occupied by the person employed on the farm. So what this implies, you must have a commercial farming operation. You must be farming the property for a monetary gain, and there would be provisions in legislation, a bit more detail around that about what you have to achieve. And that farming operation has to employ someone to work on the farm, and then they can live in the tiny home. This can be permanent occupancy, as far as I'm aware. One of the interesting things, which I must admit I don't quite have my head around, it says on agricultural land. Now, one of the interesting things about Robertson and surrounds, for example, all the land around Robertson is not actually zoned rural. It's zoned environmental protection. So there's a little question in my mind on this one about whether that land is considered agricultural land. I think it still should be, but that's a little complexity in the legislation and the way the zonings of all the rural land around Robertson, for example, has been zoned. One more under the local government regulation is natural disaster accommodation. You'll probably recall the recent floods in Lismore and the bushfires that came up into the Wingecarribee a few years ago. I understand this part of the legislation was used to help accommodate people who lost their homes in floods and bushfire. So this is pretty straightforward, this bit of legislation. So a caravan is permitted without consent. It doesn't say where you put the caravan. You must have permission of the owner to place a caravan somewhere. That caravan can be used to accommodate a person that's lost their home as a result of a natural disaster. You have to be aware that it has to be a declared natural disaster. So it can't just be a storm that comes up the coast and rips one person's roof off. That won't be a declared natural disaster. The state government is the entity that usually declares whether a bushfire or a flood has been a natural disaster. And once that's declared, then this part of the legislation becomes active and you could put someone up in a caravan on your property. Now, interestingly, it has a 2-year limit. If someone's living in a caravan as a result of losing their house, I can't imagine the authorities saying, okay, 2 years up, out you go. So there is provision in this legislation for authorities to extend that time limit, which I'm sure if they were still waiting for another house wouldn't be too much of an issue. Now, moving on to the exempt and complying provisions in the SEP that I mentioned earlier. This provision is for farm stay, which is essentially tourism. Under this legislation, they use the term movable dwellings, which could be a caravan or it could be a manufactured relocatable home type structure. And these are permitted on commercial farms. Once again, it would have to be a commercial farming operation on the property. This is very specific to certain rural zones, RU1, RU2 or RU4. Now, you might recall I just said around Robertson, all the rural land around Robertson is actually zoned environmental management. It's a C3 zone from memory. So that zoning isn't what this legislation is pointing at. So immediately around Robertson, you can't use this piece of legislation. There are some of these zones in other parts of the Wingecarribee, particularly as you go further west of Bowral, Mossvale and the highway. Some of the zonings out that way get into these rural zones. But a lot of the zones around Robertson, this wouldn't apply. So For this legislation, there are a few exceptions. There are special areas under Water New South Wales legislation. Now, these are normally water catchment areas, and I've had a look at the maps for this area. If you go into the Nepean catchment, which is north of here, not far north of Robertson, and also the smaller catchment around the WinZero reservoir are protected areas. Most of that land is not private land anyway, so it's not really relevant. But there are little bits and pieces like that in the legislation that you've got to be aware of. There's also some areas within local government where the council has excluded exempt and complying provisions. They've got permission from the state to exclude certain areas. There's very small areas in the WinZero that fit that. So long as you have a rural zone, you can use these provisions. Under these provisions, you can do up to 6 structures, 6 tiny homes on a farm. It's fairly significant. But there are planning issues you have to show that you can manage: site access, effluent disposal, parking, whole range of bits and pieces. But you don't have to enter into a full development application process. It's much more straightforward. So that's all the provisions that allow you to put a tiny home on your property without consent from council or state government. Anything else that you might want to do, and the immediate example that comes to mind might be if you've got a nice rural property like in this picture, so you want to put a tiny home on there and so someone can rent it. There is no provision in local zoning that I see that can allow you to do that. It's actually very constrained. So if you think you want to do something outside of local government regulation, I would suggest that it's going to be fairly challenging. My final thoughts: if you can use the local government regulation, use it, because that is the easiest pathway to establish a tiny home on your property. But as you can see, it does have its limitations. So certainly I would suggest do your research, talk to the tiny home manufacturers. I've found all the manufacturers I've spoken to really understand this stuff quite well and can probably provide you some advice. Talk to council, and if need be, also get planning advice, particularly if you think you want to do something that's a bit outside the square. I'd strongly recommend talking to a planner like Nat here, who's worked in the industry and knows their way around the legislation. Best wishes with your journey on your tiny homes. I've got some useful web links that will be part of the package going out online after this presentation. So if you want to go and read the local government regulation and help put yourself to sleep at night, go for your life. WinZero Council also have quite a good little tiny home page with some information on it, and the farm stay accommodation link is there as well. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be on the panel after Andy talks if you have any questions. Thank you.